G'day guys, welcome to another Soviet lens review. Today we're going to be talking about a lens that is the perfect starter lens for any of you wanting to get into the world of Soviet lenses, and taking a look at how it measures up in all of its technical characteristics, all of that good stuff as well. It is one of the most well-known Soviet lenses ever manufactured, the Helios 44M-4. So let's get into it. That's right guys, today we are taking a look at the Helios 44M4, one variant of the Helios 44 series, which was of course originally based on the Carl Zeiss Biotar design, a f2 58mm German design that has 6 elements in 4 groups. Now this long-standing design carried itself through past the Biotars. The Soviets used it for all of their Helios lenses, and it still exists today. What's so special about it? Well, the Helioses, of course, if you don't know already, they are very well known for their characteristic Biotar design, which incorporates a few little mathematical tweaks and manufacturing tweaks, which effectively means that all of the Soviet Helios 44s will display a very interesting kind of radial swirl in background bokeh at certain distances and certain apertures. Now that aside, we want to know how the Helios 44M4 is as a lens, and what actually makes it different. Well, in terms of its history, let's start there. The Helios 44M4, it comes kind of in the middle of the Helios 44 line. So it was made in the mid 1980s. My copy, as you can tell by the serial number on the bottom, was made in 1985, which is approximately when Helios 44M4s were starting to be produced. And the interesting thing about the Helios 44M4s is that it was the last Helios 44 lens to be produced with a single layer coating before the Soviets moved across to multi-coating all of their Helioses. So what you get with the Helios 44M4 is you get the sharpest single coated Helios 44 before they move to multi-coating, which some people do say has a bit of an effect on image color in particular and general color rendition. We're going to test that today. I have been playing with my Helios 44M4 for quite a while now. I actually got my copy in a kit with a Zenit Photo Sniper, and it came with this Zenit 12S film camera, which I'll be playing around with a little bit later. But back onto the lens, let's flick through its technical characteristics really quickly. It is a 58mm f2 lens. It does have a minimum focusing distance of 0.5 meters, about 50 centimeters. So it's not going to get you super close, but for a 50mm lens, particularly a 58mm lens, you can actually get your subject pretty big in the frame, and a specified resolution of 46 lines per millimeter in the center of the frame that dissipates out to 26 lines per millimeter at the edges of the frame. And what that means is that this lens should be sharp in the middle. It shouldn't be sharp on the corners of the frame. Outside of that, again, it is single coated, and it does have a bit of a disadvantage compared to some of the earlier Helioses. So the Helios 44M4, it was a design optimization, which partly was done to make this lens easier to produce and cheaper to produce. One of the optimizations that the Soviets made with this lens was that they reduced the number of aperture blades. So this lens only has 6 aperture blades in it, which does of course mean slightly less circular bokeh when you stop it down. But there you go, that is the tech specs of the lens. It is of course in the M42 mount as well, so very easy to adapt to any modern mirrorless camera. I use an M42 to Nikon Z adapter to get it onto my Nikon Z6, Z6, and it works really well. But let's go ahead and take a look at some photos. Now I recently took a trip to Jakarta, and I decided that this would be the perfect lens to take out on the streets and see how it performs. And I was really happy with it. I mean, 50mm is just such a perfect focal length for street photography. The Helios 44M-4, you know, it is no slouch when it comes to that as well. It is such an easy lens to use on the streets. It is not a very big lens, so it ends up being quite compact. You can get some nice kind of candid shots with it. And, you know, with that focus in the center of the frame, it does vignette a little as well at f2. You can get really creative and artistic like I tried to do with some of these shots here. And of course, speaking of getting artistic, you can absolutely do that with the famous Helios 44 bokeh. Managed to get a few swirly bokeh shots, but you know, this is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the Helios 44M4. There is a few issues with the Helios 44M4, and the first of those is that it was made at the Valdai plant, as you can tell by the Valdai plant logo there. Now, compared to something like KMZ, the Krasnogorsk plant, which really had the best quality control and produced the best lenses in the Soviet Union, the Valdai plant is kind of known for the opposite. You know, it's the target of Soviet lens plants. And what you'll find is lots of these old Valdai lenses in particular, they do have some issues. Lots of them have a kind of pretty old grease in them that seizes up after obviously a lot of time, after 40 years. So many of them might need a re-grease, might need a service in that regard. Many of them you will find the Valdai plant actually ended up putting too much grease on the aperture petals, on the apertures of lots of their old lenses. So what that means is that that creates a less contrasty, more kind of internal reflections when you find a Valdai lens that has too much grease on the aperture. So there are a few things to look out for, but the good news is my copy here, I stumbled across a fantastic copy. I think this is about as good of a Helios 44M4 that you could have gotten. It is still really nice to use. The focus ring is absolutely perfectly smooth. The grease hasn't seized. The aperture as well does not have too much grease on it either, so it's really, really pretty solid. Now, let's of course talk about what other weaknesses it has when it comes to picture quality, image quality. Well, internally, it is not very well blackened. What that means is that when there's lots of light coming into this lens, lots of strong light from lots of different angles, it's going to bounce around inside of it. You know, these aperture petals of the Helios 44M4 are not very well blackened whatsoever, so they're going to bounce a lot of light and generally reduce the contrast across your frame. And you can see that as well when you put this lens up against a harsh backlight. It is going to flare like crazy. It is going to lose contrast, and particularly because it's that Soviet single coating, which really, you know, does almost nothing to block that kind of incidental light, it is not going to perform very well there. Of course, you know, some people like that. Some people reckon it gives it a little bit of character. Me, I'm on the fence. I'm not, you know, convinced either which way. But at the end of the day, this is a super cheap 58mm lens. And if you want a vintage lens that gives you some flares, gives you a very interesting look, you know, you get what is on the tin with the Helios 44M4. Outside of that, what else is there to talk about with the lens? Well, my recommendations when you're using it, definitely put a lens hood on. That will help a lot with contrast. It'll help a lot with, you know, perceptual sharpness, because that's really what sharpness is. It is how sharp the photos end up looking. And when you have more contrast in the frame, your photos are going to look sharper as well. So whack yourself on a lens hood onto this lens's 52mm filter hood. Filter thread. I've actually got here my little setup. So I've got a 52 to 58mm step-up ring, which I just screw onto the front of the Helios 44M4 like that. And then once that is on, it can be a little bit tricky to get on sometimes. But once that's on, I just use a 58mm lens hood, and you know, there you go. You've got a perfectly kind of lens hooded Helios 44, which really does help a lot. You can also whack on a UV filter. Sometimes that helps if you're, you know, shooting lots of skies or shooting on really bright sunny days, like I am today on the Era 6M. I've got a UV filter on that one. But let's take a look at some coma and distortion levels now and see how well this Helios performs. As you can see, it actually performs really well. It's quite well corrected for both coma and geometric distortion, more so than some other earlier Helioses, in fact. So it gives it another plus and makes it just that little bit more neutral when you're taking photos with it. You know, lots of other things can be corrected, but coma in particular is a little bit tricky to correct in post. Outside of that, it also doesn't display too much chromatic aberration in terms of fringing, which is when you've got kind of color shifts in the color channels, particularly towards the edges of the frame, when you've got high contrasting edges. And it is a pretty neutral lens outside of that. Let's take a look next at some sharpness tests. So I went ahead and shot my Helios 44M-4 against a screen door and compared the sharpness using a program I wrote that spits out a value very similar to modern focus peaking algorithms. And we can see here that wide open, the Helios 44M4 really does lack a lot of sharpness in those edge areas. When you stop it down, as you'd expect, gets a lot sharper. But by no means is this a lens that you're going to find excellent sharpness at the corners at any aperture on. So just keep that in mind. You know, this is not the Soviet lens to be using if you want corner to corner sharpness. There are better lenses for that. I would recommend picking up something like a Zenitar M, 50mm f1.7. You're going to get a much better result if you're trying to do corner to corner sharpness with that lens. But there you go, guys. So the Helios 44M4, a very ubiquitous Soviet lens. You can buy one for much less than $100 US today. Just find yourself a good copy and, pick one up. It is a great first Soviet lens to own as long as you get yourself a good copy. And it's just so much fun to play around with. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it over other Helios 44s in the same series. If you want the sharpest Helios, go for the multi-coated Helios M7. Those later Helioses are generally just that little bit sharper, particularly around the edges. But look, as a fun street photography, maybe a little bit of videography lens, even though this lens does have a clicky aperture, the Helios 44M4 is a really, really good option. But there you go, guys. Let me know, do you have a Helios 44M4 or even any other Helios? Let me know down in the comments below. I want to hear from you. But until the next time, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you there.